Yeah, so that was a good summary from Chris about Road to Recovery. The way in which Road to Recovery is trying to support bird conservation across North America is really focusing on the development of species-specific working groups. And so they're developing different tools to help working groups think about what their priorities are and think about how they can create structures that are sustainable in the long term and effective for realizing conservation on the ground. So I received an invitation to give a presentation as part of their webinar series because the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team is really probably the best developed single species working group of really any of them except for something perhaps like California condor that actually had a captive breeding program. But the long history of the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team and its obvious success, which we'll talk about today, makes it a model for other species working groups. And the Road to Recovery team created a number of beneficial management practices for working groups to consider as they think about ways to strengthen their efforts. And I consider those in light of what the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team has done in the past and also where we are headed in the future. So a quick roadmap for the talk today. So we're going to just get a quick overview of Kirtland's Warbler natural history, so we have an understanding of why this species nearly went extinct back in the mid-20th century. A quick overview of conservation history, what the recovery of this population looked like, and some key milestones in the conservation process, which is, of course, ongoing. Discussion of the origins of the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team, how it formed and developed over time. Information on the recovery of Kirtland's Warbler and ultimately what that meant in terms of getting these species off the endangered species list. And then a review of the beneficial management practices that have been identified by the Road to Recovery initiative, and how those are reflected within the operations of the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team. And then finally, some key lessons learned from 50 years of conservation history with the Kirtland's Warbler team and how those can apply across really any bird conservation initiative. So Kirtland's Warbler is the rarest migratory songbird in North America, and they breed in jack pine forests of a particular age even. It has to be young jack pine forests, exclusively in the Great Lakes region. And they're a migratory bird. They're wintering in the scrub forests of the Bahamas, and even within the Bahamas, it appears that it is the central Bahamas that are key for the majority of the population. On both ends of their life cycle, Kirtland's Warbler is dependent on disturbance. This is especially true in the jack pine forests that naturally have a fire regime where recurring fires appear on the landscape roughly every 20 to 25 years. And its near extinction in the 20th century was largely caused by two things, being suppression of that naturally occurring fire regime, such that the young successional jack pine habitat that it relied upon just aged out of being suitable for breeding. And then also cowbird nest parasitism. So cowbirds are historically were not present or were present in very low numbers in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan, which is the core area for Kirtland's warblers to breed in. But post-logging era, cowbirds expanded into that new open country around the breeding grounds, and cowbird numbers were much, much higher for a period of time. And Kirtland's warblers really had no evolutionary history with that species and no good way to defend against that nest parasitism. So dealing with these two threats to Kirtland's warblers is really was the focus of conservation efforts for a long time. So the first Kirtland's Warbler census, and this is how things really got kicked off in terms of conservation efforts. Kirtland's Warbler was always recognized to be a very rare species, and in 1951, an ornithologist decided, you know, we really need to figure out just how many of these are there. And so they organized a census, and the census counts the singing males, which have a fairly high detectability, much more so than the females. And then they just take the number of singing males, assume that every male is paired, and double that to get a rough population estimate. In 1951, they had roughly 500 singing males. So, okay, well, that's our baseline. In 1961, they had roughly 500 singing males again. So the species is still very rare, but they feel like it's stable, it's holding its own. And then when we get to 1971, the alarm bells really go off because they repeat the census and they're down to about 200 singing males. So a real significant population crash over the decade of the 1960s. So in 1971, in response to this very concerning census number, the Kirtland's Warbler Advisory Committee is formed. And the advisory committee consists of agency and university biologists and also some members of the Michigan Audubon Society. In 1973, the Endangered Species Act is passed, and Kirtland's Warbler is in that very first group of species that get listed. As part of that process, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service needed to create a species recovery team and recognize the Kirtland's Warbler Advisory Committee as that team, renaming it the Kirtland's Warbler Recovery Team. So this is a slide that shows some of the early partners in the Kirtland's Warbler Recovery Team, those entities that were involved from the very beginning. I don't, unfortunately, have any photos from way back in the 70s to show some of who that membership was, but I did find this photo from 2004, which I think is old enough that we can consider it a vintage photo at this point. As the recovery team was in its early stages, it also added a couple additional members, being the Nature Conservancy, and then also an academic at Pennsylvania Western University, which is this woman here, Dr. Carol Bassetti. And I highlight her and also this gentleman right here, Phil Huber, who's with the U.S. Forest Service, because remarkably, Carol and Phil are actually still with the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team. And in Phil's case, it's been over 40 years that he's been involved in the Kirtland's Warbler conservation effort. And that's just reflective of the benefits of having people that commit their whole careers or a portion of it to this kind of effort, to have that continuity and have that historical institutional knowledge all the way through. So the Kirtland's Warbler recovery team and now the conservation team have really benefited from having people like Carol and Phil in it for the long haul. So following the listing in 1973, we have this period for Kirtland's warblers where the population is stable, it's not declining anymore, but despite some of the early conservation efforts, it's also not recovering, which I imagine was pretty frustrating for the people involved. They were starting to try to create habitat, they were doing small prescribed burns to reset the jack pine forest to that younger cereal stage. They were also starting to control cowbirds with cowbird traps and euthanasia, but they're not really getting the needle to move. And a key event happens in 1980 when a fire crew sets what is supposed to be a small prescribed burn, about 200 acres, but the fire got away from them. And instead of 200 acres, they burned over 20,000 acres. And that event was a real human tragedy. Many homes were destroyed in that fire. They actually lost a whole subdivision, and also a member of the fire crew died in the fire. However, that fire actually turned out to be a seminal event for Kirtland's Warbler recovery. So in 1985, the Kirtland's Warbler Recovery Plan, a foundational document, sets out this goal of 1,000 singing males. That's the target for considering the species to be recovered in the eyes of the Endangered Species Act. And what we see once we get into the 1990s is the Kirtland's warbler baby boom. And this is caused by a number of things. Some of it is the improved efficiency and understanding of habitat requirements, making sure that the habitat that is created has the right kind of configuration. The continuing effectiveness of the brown-headed cowbird control program, but also because all of that habitat that was created in the Mac Lake fire comes online. So following a wildfire, the jack pine regenerates through serotinous cones, open up, drop all their seeds, but it takes about 6 or 7 years before the jack pine reach the size that it becomes suitable for Kirtland's warbler breeding habitat. And so that's just occurring in the late 80s. And then we go from a population low in 1987 of just 167 singing males. Someone remarked that at one point you could fit the entire species into a shopping bag, which is a pretty dire situation. And then we see this incredible growth in response to all of the habitat that was created accidentally by the Mac Lake fire. And the population target of 1,000 singing males is hit for the first time in 2001. There's also another key event that happens in 2001, which is the founding of the Kirtland's Warbler Research and Training Project. So this was a project that focused on Kirtland's warblers in the Bahamas. There was a lot that was known about Kirtland's warblers on the breeding grounds and their habitat requirements, but the Bahamas remained kind of a black box even into the 2000s. People were actually looking for Kirtland's warblers in the incorrect kind of habitat. And it's only through this research project that the correct habitat that Kirtland's warblers prefer in the Bahamas was identified. Critically, this research and training project also brought Bahamians more into the conservation effort. This was a collaboration between the Nature Conservancy, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Bahamas National Trust, which is more or less the National Park Service of the Bahamas. And the training component of this whole project was that young Bahamians were recruited to be the field technicians for the research that was being done. And they worked both on the wintering grounds in the Bahamas, but then were also brought to Michigan to do work on the breeding grounds and really be exposed to the full life cycle of this species. And quite remarkably, several of the students that participated in that program are now leaders in Bahamian conservation fields. They're in government organizations and NGOs and private consulting. And I continue to be in touch with several of them, even now, 20 years later. So that program and its focus on capacity building internationally has really paid huge dividends for the overall conservation effort. So here's what the rest of our census data looks like going all the way up until the present. What we can see is that the Kirtland's warbler population continued to expand across the 2000s. And what we think we're in now is a bit of a leveling off period where the amount of available habitat is basically maxed out for Kirtland's warblers, but the species is now well above that original recovery plan target. And so that means that some other things started to happen. First, in 2015, the Kirtland's Warbler Recovery Team disbanded and then immediately reformed as the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team. And they did this in anticipation of the Kirtland's Warbler being delisted from the Endangered Species Act, which happened in 2019. Okay. So Kirtland's Warbler has been delisted, which raises the question, are we done? Do we get to walk away? Just throw on a party hat and say, that's it, success. We can go spend our time and efforts elsewhere. Well, not really, because Kirtland's Warbler is what's regarded as a conservation-reliant species. And that means that all of the work that Kirtland's warbler required to get to this point to have a recovered population that could be delisted, that work must continue. And that includes primarily the work to create habitat, which is actually mostly done through timber clear cuts, followed by replanting and not actually done through fire. And then also continued vigilance against the threat of cowbirds, which currently looks pretty good, but that is always a possibility that cowbird populations may increase again in the region and boost the nest parasitism rate beyond what is sustainable. And beyond just intensive habitat management, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient to secure the future of Kirtland's warbler. There are these other enduring risks that are out there, and those include things like loss of agency funding that's tied to the Endangered Species Act, and also just loss of focus on producing habitat. Of course, if you have a species that's endangered, that's going to be a priority for any land management agency. And in the case of Kirtland's warblers, the habitat is primarily on land that is managed by the U.S. Forest Service and the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. So with competing priorities, they may potentially lose focus. There's also remains this extreme concentration risk for Kirtland's warblers, where about 95% of the population breeds in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan, with only a smattering of small populations found in the upper peninsula of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ontario. And those are all new populations that have occurred just within roughly the last 30 years. And finally, there's unanswered questions in terms of threats to habitat on the wintering grounds. And that includes climate change. So the studies that have been done so far show that climate change, well, it is going to cause some effects on the breeding grounds. It's probably going to be more significant on the wintering grounds, where the Bahamas, because these are low-lying islands, they are likely to lose land area and also have saltwater intrusion into the freshwater lenses that are subsurface that actually support some of the vegetation that Kirtland's warblers rely on. So for those reasons, the Bahamas remains a concern and something that we need to be vigilant about. So now I want to take a shift here away from things that are specific to Kirtland's warblers and that effort, and look at the beneficial management practices that the Road to Recovery team has identified for species working groups. So much like there are best management practices for bird habitat, there are beneficial management practices for working groups. And Road to Recovery has identified 8. So the first is formation. This is a core group of stakeholders that are coming together and defining the mission of their particular working group. Second is composition. This is thinking about who is involved in the working group and thinking carefully about what kinds of expertise and representation are needed, and then going out and recruiting all those different perspectives and varied and representative geography that includes, for migratory species, representatives from the wintering grounds. Third is structure. So this is creating that framework that's needed to create leadership and authority, and also taking that broad mission of trying to recover the population of a declining species into thematic areas, which allow for individual members of the working group to focus a little bit more. Next, there's operating procedures. So operating procedures help set expectations, the rules of engagement, and things like predictable schedules that make it easier for individuals to engage in the work of the working group. Fifth, work plans and responsibilities. So these help clarify the roles and objectives of each unit within the working group, and that helps share the workload and keep people on task. Sixth is communications, and this includes both internal communications that build team cohesion and external communications that build respect and support for the effort. Seventh is founding principles, and these include things like collaboration, transparency, and trust, things that create a positive environment that encourages long-lasting relationships. And, as we saw with the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team, that example of Carol and Phil that have been involved for decades, having it be a pleasant place to be with colleagues that you respect and trust is really critical to maintaining that continuity and ensuring that people are going to be in it for the long haul. And then eighth is maintenance and sustainability. So making sure that participation continues to be relevant to members of the group, but then also financial sustainability for the effort, which includes seeking diverse funding sources and making sure that all the things that working groups do, there's a lot of balls in the air that they're juggling, that you can keep those things going, both financially and also in terms of having good organization. So within this talk, just for the purposes of time, I'm going to skip numbers 5 and 7. And we already did actually talk about the formation of the Kirtland's Warbler recovery team. So we've got that box checked. But we'll take a look at these other beneficial practices within the context of the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team. So first, composition. The composition of the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team has evolved considerably over time from the early days. These are some of the earliest organizational members of the conservation team. And one way that our composition has changed is actually a reflection of the expansion of Kirtland's Warbler's breeding range. So as Kirtland's Warblers recovered in terms of their numbers, they started breeding in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, in Wisconsin, and Ontario. And that meant bringing new organizational members on board to the conservation team. So that includes different units of the U.S. Forest Service, also the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, Canadian representatives, including Berks, which is a consulting agency, and then also as capacity was developed with Bahamas National Trust, in large part through the Kirtland's Warbler Research and Training Program that started in 2001, including them formally as a member of the conservation team. Another way in which the conservation team has evolved more recently is the addition of other nonprofit partners, which have particular capabilities that they bring to the table. So American Bird Conservancy is actually a fairly recent member of the conservation team, joining back in 2018, particularly because American Bird Conservancy has good fundraising capacity. And we'll talk about what exactly that fundraising capacity is being used for in a few slides. There's also the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance, which is a small nonprofit just focused on Kirtland's Warbler, but they have a critical role as kind of our lobbying entity. So anything that comes up in the state legislature where somebody needs to go and actually meet with the legislators that are going to vote on a bill, that is something that the Alliance really specializes in. And then Huron Pines is a local land trust and conservation organization that has their geographic focus on an area that strongly overlaps with Kirtland's Warblers in their core breeding area. And they bring a lot of expertise with things like prescribed fire, and then also collaboration between land management partners. On the academic side of things, we've also added additional scientific expertise. And one that I want to highlight here is the University of the Bahamas. So they are a new addition to the conservation team just about a year ago. And that's because a graduate of the Kirtland's Warbler Research and Training Program, he was trained in 2001 to 2002, became a professor at University of the Bahamas last year, and is part of the conservation team. So we have that through line that goes back over 20 years now in terms of building that capacity in the Bahamas. Overall, the conservation team has about 30 organizations that participate on a regular basis. So this photo here shows a big chunk of the conservation team. We have meetings every 6 months, and our summer meeting is an in-person meeting that includes a field trip. And this was a field trip to a site in the Upper Peninsula that is a collaboration between the U.S. Forest Service and the local tribe to get prescribed fire back on the landscape for the benefit of many species, including Kirtland's warblers. And I really like this photo because it shows the diversity of the organizations that are represented within the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team. Next up, we can talk about the structure of the conservation team. So the conservation team has a number of different units. The core unit is the conservation team steering committee. So that's the decision-making body. If there's any strategic decisions that need to be made, anything that's a policy-related decision, that is done by the steering committee. And then we also have the subcommittees that report to the steering committee. So our subcommittees include the breeding range and non-breeding range subcommittees. We have a human dimensions subcommittee, monitoring subcommittee. Those are the big four. And then we also have some minor subcommittees, a subcommittee that works to provide guidance to the coordinator, which is me, and also ad hoc subcommittees for things that come up, particular policy development where we know that it's going to be a short-term thing. We also have what we call working groups. We use the term a little bit differently than other folks do, but we have a jack pine research working group, which is really focused on the science of jack pine management. And then we also have a working group for expanding the breeding range that focuses on getting more Kirtland's warblers outside of the core area, just as an insurance policy. If we've got more birds in the Upper Peninsula, in Wisconsin and Ontario, than if we were to have some sort of catastrophic event in the northern lower peninsula of Michigan, we've got some backup birds. So the steering committee has about 25 members, and the full conservation team has about 75 active participants. And we also view the conservation team as a whole as nested within a broader conservation community that includes other stakeholders and also members of the general public that care about Kirtland's warblers. So making sure that we have good communication between all of these different units and between the team and the public is a big part of my job as coordinator. Next up, operating procedures. So we have a number of foundational documents that outline our operating procedures, just how we do business. And these include things like the steering committee charter, which describes the mission of the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team, outlines the composition of the steering committee. It also explains the way that we make decisions, which is through a consensus model. So it's not just a majority vote. We want to make sure that we're bringing all partners along in key decisions, and that requires us to achieve consensus. And then it also outlines the respective roles of the steering committee chair, who is going to be a representative of one of the participating organizations, but working on behalf of the whole steering committee, and then also the coordinator, which is currently me. Also, just basic IT infrastructure. So the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team conducts all its meetings over Zoom. We also have a Google Drive account, which is where we store all of our documents and make things broadly accessible to members of the team, and also can do things like collaborative editing. So it seems simple, but it's actually quite important to making sure that we have cohesion and that we can work efficiently. And then also just establishing basic meeting schedules. So we have two major meetings each year. We have a summer meeting, which is a multi-day meeting that is in person and remote. It's a hybrid format. And then we have a fully remote winter meeting, which is a one-day meeting. But having those recurring meetings on the schedule where all members of the team can get together is really important for communication across the team. The steering committee meets monthly. So I've got that highlighted in that first red box. This is a screenshot from a busy week for me with conservation team meetings. And then we also have meetings that occur on a recurring basis for the subcommittees and also the working groups. So that second highlighted red box there is one of the working groups that meets every 2 weeks. We try to ensure that each one of these other units meets at least quarterly to just keep things moving. Next up, communications. So internal communications happen in a number of different ways. I already mentioned the semi-annual meetings that we have. We also have meeting minutes that are written up, especially for the steering committee, and those are available to other members of the conservation team. Unfortunately, there is way too much email that's involved in the management of the conservation team. I've been speculating over the last couple of weeks what it would look like to create a Kirtland's Warbler conservation team Slack a community or like Discord or something like that. If we could get away from email, that would be great. But I know that creates some challenges for some of our agency folks. In addition to our internal communications, we also have a number of tools for external communications. So I produce a quarterly newsletter for the conservation team that goes out to a mailing list of about 330 people right now. So that includes other conservation professionals, but also just members of the general public that are interested in Kirtland's warbler conservation. We also have a website that I maintain a little bit. It needs some work, but we do have a website that's fairly comprehensive and describes the work of the team. There's also publications that come out, both peer-reviewed scientific publications, as well as publications that are things in the public media, newspaper and blogs and podcasts even. So those are other ways that we can communicate with the general public. And then, although the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team itself doesn't have any social media accounts, many of the affiliate organizations do, including the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance is particularly active on Facebook and Instagram. So finally, and critically, maintenance and sustainability. I'm thinking about how do we keep all of this going. So Road to Recovery and their discussions with various working groups have really identified that having a designated coordinator is very important, having that point person who makes sure that things stay on track. In the case of the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team, that coordinator started out as borrowed staff. So from 2015 to 2020, that was borrowed staff from a local nonprofit that had strong mission overlap with the conservation team. And then in 2020, the first paid dedicated coordinator was hired, and that was a part-time position. In 22, when I was hired, that's when the coordinator position evolved into a full-time position. And my job description as coordinator is actually available to you if you'd like to see it. And I have a link at the end of the presentation for that document. So the funding that supports the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team coordinator right now is about 50-50 split between federal and state agency funding, and then also grants from large foundations. And so that's a good funding mix where we're not too reliant on any one source, and we feel confident that we can keep that funding support for the position moving forward, at least in the short term. However, in the long term, the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team does have a financial plan. So there are two Kirtland's Warbler investment funds that have been created. One is held by American Bird Conservancy, and the other is held by the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. So the ABC fund has a lot of flexibility. This is money that was all raised from private donors, and just for anything related to Kirtland's warblers. So this fund has no jurisdictional boundaries. It can be used for work in the Bahamas. It can be used for human dimensions work, scientific research. It can be used for support of the coordinator position, really anything that is determined as a priority need, and that's a decision that's made by the steering committee. We also have the Michigan DNR Fund, which was specifically created to address long-term management for brown-headed cowbirds. And that fund actually, because cowbirds right now are not being trapped in Michigan, it looks like those funds could potentially be used for something else. But the core of that fund is really dedicated to ensuring that cowbirds are not a problem now and indefinitely into the future are able to be dealt with if they need to be. And in terms of sustainability of this whole effort, I think it's really important to highlight the ongoing capacity building work that's happening in the Bahamas. So this is some of the work that I do, especially when I'm wearing my hat as Kirtland's Warbler Program Director for American Bird Conservancy, and continuing to develop that both scientific and in the field capacity to manage Kirtland's warbler habitats in the Bahamas. So lessons learned from 50 years of this conservation collaboration. First, collaboration works best in an open and honest environment. When parties are frank about what their priorities are and what capacity they have, then you can work together to make sure that things get done, but also that you don't get overextended, overcommitted, and let people down if you just don't have the capacity. So that's really important. Also, overlapping responsibilities, which we definitely do have within the conservation team across so many different organizations. This is not redundant. This is actually resilient. Having that shared workload allows the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team to have some turnover, both in people and then sometimes even in organizations. And it allows for occasional failure, to have things that don't get done by a particular individual or organization, or something gets tried and it doesn't work, like experimenting with habitat on the ground. You have more flexibility to do that if you know that you're not the only one with the responsibility for that particular conservation action. Third, institutionalization of knowledge is really important. And so archiving documents and making sure things are well organized, whether it's a Google Drive or some other easily accessible format, that's great. But what's even better is using the conservation team or working group framework to raise up new leadership and have that passage of knowledge from one generation to the next, which we're actually seeing happen right now in the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team, which is pretty cool to see. Having accountability mechanisms, really important. It's one thing to have a conservation plan all written out. It's a great plan, but if you don't actually have the accountability to make sure that the actions outlined in a plan are realized on the ground and that you're getting the results that you want, and that you have monitoring of the results, then it doesn't really matter that much. And so in addition to just monitoring the populations, you could also have monitoring of, other priorities, just monitoring of the operations of the working group, and just have people that are looking out to make sure that everything is sustainable moving forward. And to the extent that you can use numbers for these accountability mechanisms, that's really, really beneficial. We actually have a situation right now with Kirtland's Warbler where we've had a dip for a few years in terms of the acres of breeding habitat that were produced, and being able to have firm targets for what those acreages should be allowed us to look at that, say, okay, we've got some administrative issues and we need to coordinate across all of the land management organizations and get ourselves back on track. And that's now happening. And it's happening pretty smoothly because we have these accountability mechanisms in place. And then finally, patience and diligence. So changing the trajectory of a bird population takes decades. It does not happen overnight. This is a long haul. And we see that with Kirtland's warblers, where conservation efforts absolutely can work, and they can work very, very well. But remember, the Kirtland's warbler had that period of 15 to 20 years of not really getting that upwards trajectory. And so being really patient and diligent through times where you might seem like you're stagnating a little bit, but you're still learning and you're still adapting and developing all of the tools you need to be successful. All of that is still happening. So being patient and diligent is really important. So if you'd like to learn more about the Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team, you can shoot me an email. I also have a couple of links here, one for our website, and also I created a Google Drive folder that includes our foundational documents. So this includes our charter, an organization chart, some of our conservation plans, the policy that guides our long-term fund, also example newsletters, and my coordinator job description. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.